Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It all started with a question: what's the value of something that doesn't work anymore? I had asked myself this as I stood in the dusty, dimly lit corner of the antique store. Shelves were cluttered with objects, things that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten years. But it was the phone that caught my eye. It wasn't much, just a simple, old rotary phone, its brass body tarnished with time and use, but there was something about it that drew me in. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a stooped back, noticed my gaze. "Ah, you've got an eye for the unique," he said with a thin smile. "This one's special. Used to belong to a family upstate. Haven't seen it in years." He spoke in a tone that suggested both pride and mystery, but I was too curious to ask more. I just had to have it. The phone was in a strange condition. The dial was worn, the receiver cracked in places, yet it had a peculiar charm, an air of age that seemed to whisper secrets I was eager to hear. It was only when I returned home and plugged it in that things started to get strange. At first, it was quiet. Too quiet. The house was silent, as it usually was at night. The kind of silence that almost feels oppressive. I placed the phone on a small table in the corner of my living room and left it there, deciding to explore the rest of my house before heading to bed. The air had a chill to it that wasn't there before, but I dismissed it as just a change of season. Around midnight, I was just settling into bed when I heard it. A faint clicking noise, barely perceptible at first, like the sound of someone dialing a number. I dismissed it, thinking it was a strange trick of my mind or the house settling. But then it came again, louder this time. A dial tone, faint but unmistakable. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was some kind of residual hum from the old phone. But that night, as I lay there in bed, unable to sleep, I heard something else, a sound that made my blood run cold. The phone began to ring. I sat up immediately, heart pounding in my chest. The room was still dark, save for the dim moonlight spilling in through the window. The sound of the phone's bell cut through the silence, reverberating in my ears. It wasn't a modern ringtone or an electronic beep. It was the deep, mechanical clang of an old-fashioned phone. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and walked toward the living room. The ringing persisted, each ring louder than the last, as though it was calling me specifically. I reached for the receiver, my hand trembling slightly, and lifted it to my ear. The moment I did, a voice came through, low and raspy, almost drowned by static. "Help, it's coming for you." The words were clear enough, but the voice sounded strange, distorted, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth. The tone was urgent, pleading. It spoke my name, but it wasn't a voice I recognized. The chill that had crept into the air earlier intensified, and my skin broke out in goosebumps. I could barely breathe. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of prank? An odd coincidence? Or something worse? The voice on the other end repeated itself, more clearly this time. "Help, it's coming for you, Mark." That was my name. But how could it know that? The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I almost dropped the receiver in shock. But I didn't. Instead, I pressed the phone harder against my ear, trying to make sense of the noise. What was happening? The silence that followed felt suffocating. Just the distant hum of the house settling. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the quiet hum of the phone line. Eventually, the call ended, and I placed the receiver back down, unsure of what to do next. The eerie silence that followed was even worse than the ringing itself. The strange feeling that had settled over the house lingered. It wasn't just a phone, I realized. This was something else. Something that was more than it appeared. And it had my name. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed a line I could never return from. The following days were a blur. My mind kept circling back to that phone call, replaying every detail over and over, as though the memory might offer some explanation. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The phone had been silent ever since, as if the events of that night had never happened at all. I tried to go about my daily life. I went to work, I ate, I slept. Yet, there was always an edge of unease that clung to me, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. Was it just a phone? Was I imagining things? The voice had been so clear, so real. The words echoed in my head, "It's coming for you." The phone remained untouched on the small table, its presence haunting the room more than I cared to admit. I'd catch myself glancing at it every now and then, wondering if it would ring again, but nothing happened. But then, on the fourth night after the call, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard it. The faintest click. My stomach dropped, and my heart began to race. It was the same sound I'd heard before, like someone dialing a number, the unmistakable rhythm of an old rotary phone. I froze. I didn't want to believe it. But I had no choice. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stood up quickly, the book slipping from my lap as I rushed to the living room. The phone's bell rang louder than it had the previous night, an almost frantic urgency in its sound. My hand shook as I reached for the receiver, the cold metal sending a shock through my fingertips. As soon as I lifted the receiver, the voice came through again, even more distorted this time. "Mark, help, you need to listen." I felt my pulse quicken as I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, trying to make out the words. The voice seemed to struggle, as if something was interfering with the transmission. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was a long pause, the static crackling like thunder in my ear. And then, finally, a reply. "You don't remember, do you? You were there once before." The words hung in the air, making no sense, yet somehow feeling like they were meant for me. I had never heard this voice before, but it seemed to know something about me, something deep and hidden. "Who's coming for me?" I asked, the question tumbling out before I could stop myself. The voice hesitated again, then replied, the words almost broken, as if something or someone was trying to keep it from speaking. "Your past. It won't let you go. It's watching. It's waiting." A chill ran down my spine, and I gripped the receiver tighter. My mind raced. Past? What past? "How do you know my name?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The voice was silent for a long time. I was about to hang up, convinced that it was just some elaborate prank, when it came back, louder, more urgent. "Because you were here, Mark. You were here before. You saw what we did." The words made no sense, but they shook me to my core. My knees buckled, and I sank into the nearest chair, the phone still pressed against my ear. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I had to get away from this phone, from whatever this was. But when I moved to hang up, I noticed something strange. The dial on the phone was moving. Slowly, it turned by itself, as if an unseen hand was dialing a number. The soft clicking filled the room, the sound of a number being entered one digit at a time. It wasn't me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the phone, paralyzed with fear. The air felt heavier, the silence suffocating. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the dial stopped. The phone went silent. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My hands trembled as I slowly placed the receiver back on the hook, the phone's brass surface cold against my palm. I stared at the phone for a long time, unsure of what to do next. It had stopped ringing, but the words, the voice, everything still lingered in the air. Your past is waiting. What past? What had I forgotten? The question burned in my mind, but I had no answers. I didn't know what was worse, the phone calling me again, or the feeling that it never really stopped. That somehow, somewhere, it was always watching, waiting to make contact again. The days that followed the second call felt like a blur. I went through the motions, but something inside me had changed. It wasn't just the phone anymore. It was the feeling that there was something lurking, something watching from the edges of my vision. The air around me seemed heavier, charged with an unsettling energy I couldn't explain. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat properly. Every time I tried to focus on anything, my mind kept drifting back to that voice, to the words it had said. You were here, Mark. You saw what we did. What did it mean? What had I seen? The harder I tried to remember, the more distant the memories seemed, as if something was blocking me from reaching them. The phone remained in the same spot on the table, silent for now. But it felt like a presence in the room, like it was waiting, biding its time until I would pick it up again. One evening, I could no longer ignore the mounting tension. I walked over to the phone, my breath shallow, and stared at it for a moment. The room around me felt colder, the shadows deeper. The house, once familiar, now seemed alien to me. The walls seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. I touched the receiver with trembling fingers, but before I could lift it, I heard something else. A sound. A soft scratching noise, almost like nails on wood. It was coming from behind the walls. I froze. At first, I thought it might be the house settling, the old wood creaking as it did every night. But this was different. This sound was deliberate. It was rhythmic. And it was coming from somewhere just beyond the walls, somewhere near the phone. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move. My body felt rooted to the spot. The scratching continued, almost in time with my breathing, growing louder with each passing second. It was like something, or someone, was trying to get through. I stepped back slowly, my eyes darting to the corner of the room. The shadows seemed to shift, lengthening as if they were stretching toward me. I glanced at the phone, still sitting there, untouched. But something in the back of my mind told me it wasn't the phone I needed to be afraid of. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. The air seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. I could feel my pulse thrumming in my ears, every nerve screaming at me to leave, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. Something kept me there. I approached the wall where the noise had come from, my hand brushing lightly against the surface. The wood felt unnaturally cold, and my fingers twitched as if they wanted to pull away. But then, as I touched it, a strange sensation passed through me, like a current of electricity running under the skin. I pulled my hand back, startled, and took a step away from the wall. The scratching started again, louder now, almost frantic. It was coming from deeper within the walls, as though something, or someone, was trapped inside. I turned back toward the phone. The receiver was off the hook now. It had moved. It hadn't been like this before. I was certain of it. The receiver was dangling at an angle, as if someone had just put it down carelessly. But I hadn't touched it. The phone rang. The sound was sharp, like a sudden shock that shot through my body. It felt real, too real. I staggered back, my eyes wide with terror, as the ringing grew louder, the echo of each bell reverberating in the walls around me. I rushed to the phone, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I reached for it, almost afraid to hear what might come through this time. "Mark," the voice whispered, this time even fainter, as if it was struggling to reach me. I closed my eyes, my stomach turning. "Please," I begged silently, "not again. Mark, you need to listen. They're coming. They're already inside." The voice was weak, but its words sent a chill straight to my bones. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a phone call. It was something else, something that had been building, that had been waiting. "What do you mean? Who's coming?" I forced myself to speak, but my voice trembled with fear. They're inside. They never left. You saw them. You remember them." The static on the line grew louder, and for a moment, the voice was lost in a crackling burst of white noise. My hands gripped the receiver tighter, my knuckles going white. The voice cut off suddenly. Then, through the static, came a sound I recognized, the sound of breathing. Deep, labored breaths. They were coming from the other end of the line. I pulled the receiver away from my ear, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around me seemed to thicken, the silence stretching into something suffocating. Something was in the house with me. I turned, desperate to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing, twisting into shapes that weren't quite right. I couldn't escape. The phone went silent. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I looked around, and that's when I saw it, a dark shape just beyond the doorway. A figure, standing still, unmoving. It was watching me. I stood frozen, my eyes locked onto the figure that had appeared in the doorway. It was hard to tell exactly what it was. Its outline was barely discernible in the dim light, but there was something unsettling about it. The shadows around it seemed to curl and stretch, almost as if they were alive, moving with a life of their own. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but remain there, paralyzed with fear. But my body refused to obey. My breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, and my legs felt like they would give out beneath me. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum, each beat louder than the last. Then, the figure took a step forward. It moved so slowly, so deliberately, that I could feel every second of its approach. The floor creaked beneath its weight, the sound like a death knell in the silence. I wanted to look away, to escape, but my eyes were locked on it, unable to break free. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw it more clearly now. It was tall, far too tall for a normal person. Its form was twisted, its proportions wrong in ways that didn't make sense. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging by its sides like they were made of something other than flesh. The face. I could barely make it out, but the little I could see made my stomach turn. Its skin was gray, stretched too tight across its skull. And its eyes, those eyes, they were wide, hollow, like black pits staring into my very soul. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. My entire body was frozen in place, as though some invisible force had a hold on me. The figure didn't speak. It didn't make a sound, save for the soft rasping of its breath, like it was coming from deep within its chest. It was close now, so close I could feel its presence, a suffocating weight in the air. I could smell it, too. The stench of something rotten, like old, decayed wood, mixed with something far worse. I tried to make a sound, to shout, to do anything, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare, paralyzed by the thing before me. Then, without warning, it reached out. Its hand, long and spindly, extended toward me. I could see every joint in its fingers, every knuckle, every bone. Its fingers twitched, almost like it was testing the air, reaching for me. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. The moment its hand touched my skin, a shock ran through me, like a jolt of electricity, sharp and sudden. The world around me seemed to blur, to distort, as though I was being pulled somewhere else. The room grew colder. The walls seemed to stretch, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. The figure's grip tightened, and a sharp pain shot through my arm. I gasped, but no sound escaped my mouth. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. The phone rang again. The shrill sound cut through the air, so loud it was almost deafening. I tried to pull away from the figure, but it held me fast. Its grip was unrelenting, cold and firm, like something not entirely human. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted, the static almost drowning it out. But I could still hear it. Barely. "Mark, help, they're here, they never left." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever had been watching me, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, was now here. And it wasn't going to let me go. With a burst of panic, I pulled away from the figure, stumbling back. The phone's ringing grew louder, the voice more desperate. But as I moved, the thing followed. Its footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the hollow space of the house, like the sound of a death march. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the handle. But before I could open it, the phone fell silent. The house was once again eerily quiet. The figure stopped, standing perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me to make a move. It didn't move any closer, but it didn't let me leave either. It was as though it was waiting for something, waiting for me to do something that would finally break the silence. I felt the cold creeping into my bones, the weight of the thing's gaze pressing down on me. The shadows were closing in, the air thick with the smell of decay. My chest tightened with fear. And then, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was coming from the walls, but it wasn't just a single place. The scratching was everywhere. It was coming from the ceiling, the floor, the corners of the room. It was as though the house itself was alive, writhing with unseen creatures, all waiting to escape. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. And the phone, the cursed phone, remained silent. But I knew, deep down, that the silence wouldn't last for long. It never did. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The shadows, thick and oppressive, seemed to close in tighter around me. The walls felt like they were breathing, exhaling in heavy, rasping breaths that matched the rhythm of my own panicked heart. The phone had fallen silent, but I knew it wasn't over. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the dim light. Its presence loomed in my peripheral vision, a constant reminder of something terrible just beyond my reach. It didn't move, didn't speak. But I could feel its gaze, its endless, unblinking stare boring into me like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I had to leave. I had to escape. But no matter how much I willed my legs to move, they wouldn't obey. Fear had rooted me in place. And then I heard it again. The soft scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was inside my head. The sound was sharp, relentless. It was like a voice, like something trying to claw its way out from within my own thoughts. It was no longer distant, no longer hidden behind the walls. It was here, in the very air I breathed. "Mark," the voice whispered in my ear, cold and hollow, just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "Help me," the voice pleaded, desperate and raw, as though it was begging for something it could never have. It was the same voice from the phone. I gasped, stepping back. The figure was gone. It was no longer in the doorway, no longer standing in the shadows. It was right behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I felt it. The chill in the air, the damp breath on my neck. The cold hands that seemed to hover just inches from my skin. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as I fumbled for the handle. The scratching continued, louder now, like 100 claws scraping against the inside of my skull. It was unbearable. The phone rang. A sudden, shrill sound that cut through the air like a knife. I jumped, my heart racing as the room seemed to close in on me. The phone was ringing again, but this time I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear it. But my hand moved, almost of its own accord. Slowly, I lifted the receiver to my ear. "Mark," the voice said, low and drawn out. My stomach churned. The voice was no longer distorted. It was clearer now. It was the same voice, but somehow different. "It's too late, Mark. You can't escape." I tried to speak, but my throat was tight, my words caught. I couldn't breathe. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out. "What do you want?" The voice paused, as though considering its response. Then it whispered, almost tenderly, "We are everything you've forgotten." I felt a cold rush of dread flood over me. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, the phone still pressed against my ear. My mind raced, but the words didn't make sense. What had I forgotten? What did it mean? The voice continued, the words like a cold wind that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't run from the past. It's always been there, Mark. Watching. Waiting. You were never meant to forget." A low hum began to build in the room, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. It felt like the house itself was alive, pulsing with energy that didn't belong. And then, everything went dark. The lights flickered, then went out completely. The air grew colder, and the silence became deafening. The hum in the walls reached a crescendo, vibrating through my bones. I dropped the receiver. My hand reached out in the darkness, my breath shallow and fast. I tried to stand, tried to run, but the floor beneath me seemed to shift, to move, as though it was no longer solid ground. I stumbled, my legs giving way, and I fell to the floor with a crash. The house groaned, the walls shuddering with a terrible, inhuman sound. The scratching in my head grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like my skull was going to crack open. And then, I heard it. A voice. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, merging into one distorted, hollow roar. Mark. The walls seemed to close in on me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I felt something grab me, cold hands pulling at my arms, my legs. Something was inside me now, something that had been waiting all this time. The house was no longer just a house. It was something else, something old, something alive. I fought against the grip, clawing at the floor, but the darkness was overwhelming. The voices grew louder, more frantic, until they drowned out everything else. You shouldn't have come back, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds, thousands, echoing through my mind, twisting and contorting. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. And then, I was gone. The phone rang one last time, and it was silent. Have you ever had that strange feeling that something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it? You know the feeling when you're so familiar with something, with a place, a routine, that you feel it should be impossible for anything to feel out of place. And yet, one day, it happens. Something shifts. It's the little things that make it all the more unsettling. A flicker of movement, a change in the air. But it's not until later that you realize it's never been quite the same since that moment. I've been taking the same train to work for years. It's a routine that has become a part of me, as familiar as breathing. Every morning, I board the same train at the same time, standing in the same spot, leaning against the same pole by the door. The same faces, the same sounds, the same rhythm of the journey. But one morning, something changed. I boarded the train, as I always did, but as I walked down the aisle looking for my usual seat, I stopped. There was someone sitting there, right in my seat. The seat I always take, the one by the window, where I can see the city passing by in a blur of motion. But it wasn't just anyone sitting there. No, this person, this man, looked exactly like me. Not someone who resembled me, but someone who looked exactly like me. Same height, same build, same facial features. Even the way he was dressed, black jacket, dark jeans, boots, was the same. The only difference was the slight variation in the shade of his shirt, a faintly different color, but everything else was identical. For a moment, I stood there, frozen. A jolt of confusion surged through me. I blinked, half expecting the man to disappear, or for me to realize I was dreaming. But no, he was there. Just sitting there, looking out the window, as though nothing was wrong. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what to do. Should I say something? But how could I explain what was happening? He was me, or at least, he looked like me. I hesitated, then moved down the aisle, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness of the train car. My mind was racing. Was this a prank? Was I hallucinating? Could this be some sort of bizarre coincidence, or was something deeper, darker at play? I found another seat further down the car, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. The man, myself, it felt like, sat there, unmoving. There was no sign of recognition, no shift in his posture to indicate that he even noticed me watching him. He simply stared out the window, like he belonged there. I couldn't focus on anything else. The train's usual sounds, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the soft hum of the engine, felt distant, muffled. My thoughts were consumed by him, by that unsettling image of someone who mirrored me so perfectly. The more I looked at him, the more disoriented I became. I tried to shake it off. It had to be some kind of strange coincidence. Maybe there was someone else in the world who looked like me. But as the train moved on, I couldn't escape the feeling that this was no coincidence at all. There was something about him, something beneath the surface that I couldn't explain. It was like I was staring at a reflection, but the reflection was wrong somehow. Like it was a version of me that shouldn't exist. Then, just as the train began to slow at the next station, he turned his head. Slowly, deliberately, his eyes meeting mine across the aisle. And in that moment, I felt it, the jolt of recognition. Not the kind of recognition you feel when you see someone you know, but something darker, something deeper. He knew me. And I knew that he was waiting for something. For me to acknowledge him. For me to understand. But what? The train jerked to a stop, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. The murmur of voices, the sound of the door opening, the shuffle of feet, everything faded away. It was just me and him, locked in that moment of silent exchange. I wanted to get up, to run, to leave the car, but my legs were frozen. My heart raced, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something that sent a chill crawling down my spine. Then, without a word, he stood. He rose slowly from the seat, his movements fluid and effortless, as though this was all perfectly normal. I watched him walk toward the door, and then, just as he reached it, he glanced over his shoulder. His eyes locked onto mine again, and this time, there was a smirk, a small, knowing smile that twisted something inside me. And then, he was gone. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, and the train pulled away, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The world outside the window blurred, the landscape a haze of movement as the train accelerated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something deep within me, something I couldn't understand. I had seen him. Or rather, I had seen myself. I sat in stunned silence for the rest of the journey, the unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just that he looked like me, it was the way he moved, the way he was. That slight difference in his shirt color, that unsettling smile, something about it didn't sit right. As I stepped off the train and made my way to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. That maybe, somewhere out there, there was another version of me, living a life that mirrored mine, but not quite. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had looked like, what he had been. And then, in the back of my mind, the question began to surface, slowly creeping its way to the forefront of my thoughts. What if I wasn't the real one? The day after the encounter, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled deep within me. Everything seemed off. It was as though the world had subtly shifted, and I was no longer sure where I fit into it. I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on work. I made my way through the usual meetings, the dull hum of conversations filling the office, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the train, to that man, to that other version of me. The question lingered like a shadow at the back of my mind, What if I wasn't the real one? I tried to laugh it off, tried to tell myself it was just a bizarre coincidence. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing unease. Something about him, about the way he smiled, about the way he had looked at me, it felt like a warning. Like I had seen a glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to. By the time I boarded the train that evening, the anxiety had turned into something else. It was a gnawing sense of dread, like I was walking into a trap I didn't understand. I took my usual place by the door, the spot where I always stood. I leaned against a pole, staring out the window as the train began its journey. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks should have been soothing, but instead, it felt like a countdown. The seat next to mine, my usual seat, was empty, but I couldn't stop glancing at it. I almost expected him to appear again, to take that seat and smile at me with that same eerie expression. My breath caught every time someone walked down the aisle, each footstep making my heart race a little faster. But nothing happened. The train rattled along, the city passing by in flashes of light and shadow. I tried to focus on the familiar sights outside the window, but my mind kept wandering back to the man I had seen. The stranger who was me. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure moved in the aisle, heading toward the seat across from me. I froze. It wasn't him, or at least, I didn't think it was him at first. But as the figure came closer, the recognition hit me. It was him. The man. The version of me. He was standing in front of me, his eyes locked onto mine. That same smirk. That same twisted, knowing look. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath shallow. I stood up abruptly, my legs unsteady beneath me. My mouth went dry, and I couldn't bring myself to speak. I had to get away. I needed to leave this train, this place, this moment. I turned, trying to make my way to another car, but he stepped in front of me, blocking my path. His presence was suffocating. I could feel the air growing heavy around me, and the sound of the train, usually so familiar, so grounding, now seemed distant and hollow. He didn't speak, didn't have to. His eyes, they told me everything. He knew exactly what I was thinking, exactly what I was afraid of. I tried to push past him, but my body felt sluggish, unresponsive, as if I were wading through thick water. My head was spinning, my mind scrambling for an explanation. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But there he was. I was standing in front of myself, and I didn't know what to do. His lips parted, and for the first time, he spoke. "Do you really think you're the real one?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, like he already knew the answer. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to respond. What did he mean by that? "I've been waiting," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, but somehow it cut through the noise of the train, through the pounding in my ears. "Waiting for you to notice. Waiting for you to understand. But you never did you? You never realized. I've been here the whole time." His words sank deep into my mind, twisting, turning. It was like he was speaking directly to a part of me I hadn't even known existed. A part that suddenly felt exposed, raw. I took a step back, my heart racing. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" My voice was shaking. The words felt foreign, wrong, as if I were watching myself speak from the outside. He smiled, that smile, the one that twisted something inside me. "I'm you. Or rather, I'm the version of you that never let go. The one that never accepted what you've become." A chill ran down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my feet. He reached out a hand, not to touch me, but to stop me from retreating any further. Don't run. You can't escape it. You're me, and I'm you. We're one and the same. And now it's time for you to see the truth. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. I wanted to scream, to fight, to wake up from this nightmare. But no sound came. The train car seemed to grow colder, darker, as if the very air was thickening around us, suffocating me. Do you know why you're here? He asked, his voice now a soft, mocking tone. Why you keep seeing me, why I keep appearing. You think this is a mistake, don't you? A coincidence. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. The more I tried to understand, the more disoriented I became. You've been running from yourself, Mark, he said softly. But you can't outrun what you are. What we are. I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me, and I had a sudden, terrifying realization. He wasn't just a mirror image of me. He was something else. A twisted version of me, a darker reflection. And suddenly, I didn't know what was real anymore. I could feel the cold sweat gathering on my forehead. My pulse hammered in my chest, and my breaths came in shallow gasps. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He was standing so close now, his presence suffocating, and I couldn't escape his gaze. Mark, he had called me. How did he know my name? Why was he calling me that? My mind struggled to process the questions, but the answers felt just out of reach, slipping away as quickly as they came. You think you're the real one, he continued, his voice soft but sharp like a blade. But what does that even mean? What makes you real? Just because you've lived this life? Walked this path? Do you think that makes you more real than me? I didn't know how to respond. His words twisted in my mind like a knot I couldn't untangle. It felt as though he was pushing me into a corner, forcing me to confront something I wasn't ready to face. I took a step back, my feet finally responding, but he matched my movement, staying just a few steps ahead, his eyes never leaving mine. Why are you doing this? I managed to choke out. My voice was hoarse, like I hadn't used it in days. What do you want from me? He smirked, that same knowing smile. I'm not doing anything, Mark. I'm just showing you the truth. You've been running from it for so long, pretending like everything's fine. But deep down, you know something's wrong. You've always known. The train's sudden lurch as it pulled into a station startled me, snapping me out of the trance his words had put me in. For a moment, everything seemed to return to normal. The sound of the doors opening, the shuffle of passengers moving in and out, the usual mundane noise of the train. But it didn't feel normal. Nothing felt normal anymore. The weight of the moment pressed down on me harder than before. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the train. What are you talking about? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, his expression unreadable. The brief silence felt like an eternity, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, finally, he spoke, but his tone had changed. It was softer now, almost sympathetic. You've been living a lie, Mark. You're not the only version of you out there. There are countless others. And one of them is me. I swallowed hard, trying to digest his words, but they made no sense. How could there be other versions of me? I was me. Just me. How is that even possible? I asked, the question tumbling out before I could stop myself. He sighed, as though explaining something painfully simple to a child. You don't get it, do you? There's more than one reality. More than one version of us. And somewhere along the line, things split. His words felt like a hammer striking my skull. More than one reality? More than one version of me? It didn't make sense. How could this be happening? I was just a regular guy, a guy who had lived a normal life, until now. How do you know all this? I asked, barely able to keep my voice steady. How do you know everything about me? He met my eyes, his gaze unwavering. Because I'm you. I remember everything about your life. Your memories, your choices, your mistakes. I've lived them, too. But I made different choices. And now, I'm here. I shook my head, trying to push the panic out of my chest. This can't be real. This can't be happening. But deep down, I knew it was. I knew this was no coincidence. He took a step closer to me, his presence overwhelming. You've lived your life as if it's all that matters. But you're just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And you've only seen one side of it. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. My mind couldn't keep up with what he was saying. It was like he was speaking a language I didn't understand, and yet I felt like I had heard it before. I knew these words. Somewhere deep inside me, I recognized them. I looked down at the floor, trying to steady myself, but my legs felt weak. What do you want from me? I asked again, the question almost pleading. Why are you doing this? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just watched me, that same unsettling smile still playing at the corner of his lips. Because you need to see the truth, Mark, he said finally. You need to understand that you're not who you think you are. You're not the person you've convinced yourself you are. The life you've built, it's a lie. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. The train's steady motion, the sound of the wheels against the track, it all became distant, like I was trapped in a dream. Was this even real? I looked at him, at myself, and felt a wave of unease wash over me. This wasn't just about a strange encounter on a train anymore. This was something much deeper. Something darker. What happens now? I whispered, my voice barely audible. What do I do? He stared at me for a long moment, as if weighing my question. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was cold. Unnaturally cold. It's not about what you do, he said softly. It's about what you realize. You've been living someone else's life. It's time to wake up. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of passengers. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stood there, staring at the spot where he had been, my mind spinning. Had I been living someone else's life? Was this all a dream, a twisted illusion? I didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain, I couldn't ignore what I had just experienced. And now, I was left with a terrifying question. What if he was right? The train ride that night felt different. The normal sounds, the steady clack of the wheels, the hum of the lights above, the murmur of other passengers seemed muffled, distant. My mind was a whirlwind, spinning with confusion, dread, and disbelief. What was happening to me? I couldn't shake the image of the man, or rather, the other me, walking away without a word, disappearing into the crowd of passengers like he had never been there at all. I glanced around the car, half expecting him to reappear, but the seats were empty. The passengers had resumed their conversations, their quiet routines. But it all felt wrong. Like I was the only one out of place, the only one who could see the cracks in reality. I clutched the edge of the seat, trying to steady myself. My hands were trembling. The train rumbled on, but I couldn't focus on the familiar scenery outside. My thoughts were a blur. I kept running through the same questions over and over again. What did he mean? Why did he look like me? It had to be a coincidence, right? A trick of the mind, a strange meeting of two people who just happened to resemble each other. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I knew there was something more to it. Something I didn't understand, something I didn't want to understand. The doors of the train slid open with a soft hiss as we pulled into the next station. People began to shuffle out, some heading to their destinations, others stepping back onto the platform, but I remained frozen in place. I couldn't move. The weight of the encounter, the things he had said, felt like chains around my chest. My breath quickened, and I was suddenly aware of how still everything had become. The man had been right about one thing. I was living a lie. But how? How had I been deceived? What had I missed? The train continued its journey, but the world outside the window seemed to blur. I could feel a sense of dread building inside me, growing with each passing minute, each second that ticked away. I reached into my jacket pocket, my hand instinctively seeking the comfort of my phone. I needed to check something, anything, to ground myself. But as I pulled it out, I noticed something strange. The screen was cracked. No, not cracked. It was warped. The image was distorted, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I stared at it, blinking, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. My phone had been perfectly fine when I left the office. Yet now, it looked as though it had been through a storm. I pressed the power button, but nothing happened. The screen flickered once, then went completely black. What the hell is going on? I shoved the phone back into my pocket, the cold metal feeling heavy against my leg. The train lurched again, and I stumbled, catching myself against the pole. My head spun, and for a brief moment, I felt like I was going to fall. But I steadied myself and forced my attention back to the door, my gaze scanning the crowd of passengers. That's when I saw him again. He was sitting in one of the seats across from me, looking out the window as though nothing had happened. But it was him. I knew it. The same expression, the same posture. Everything about him was eerily familiar. It felt like I was staring at a reflection, but it wasn't me. It was something else. Something darker. He caught my gaze and smiled. That same twisted, knowing smile. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was frozen in place. I couldn't look away. It felt like the train was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. The other me leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine, and for a moment, I thought I heard him whisper, just loud enough for me to hear over the noise of the train. You can't escape it, Mark. You or me. I closed my eyes, trying to block out his words, trying to make it all stop. But the sounds of the train, the screech of the wheels, the flickering of the lights, were only getting louder. The pressure in the car was unbearable, suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. When I opened my eyes again, the seat across from me was empty. The man was gone. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the train, my eyes darting from passenger to passenger. No one seemed to notice anything strange. The same people, the same faces. But something was off. Something was wrong. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I stood up, my legs shaking, and walked toward the exit, my footsteps unsteady as I pushed through the crowd of commuters. I needed to get out of there. I needed to escape this place, this situation. I stumbled onto the platform, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The station was nearly empty. The dim lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. And then, from behind me, I heard it. The sound of footsteps. I turned, but there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing, but the footsteps continued. They were getting closer, echoing in the empty station. My heart raced. I spun around again, my eyes scanning the platform. No one. The station was completely deserted. But the footsteps, they were still there. I took a step back, my eyes darting around. The sound was unmistakable. The rhythmic echo of footsteps, slow and deliberate, drawing nearer with every passing second. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze. The air around me went still, and I slowly turned, dreading what I might see. But there, standing right behind me, was the man. The other me. I told you, he whispered, his voice low and smooth, you can't escape yourself. My body froze as I faced him, the coldness of his touch still lingering on my shoulder. I wanted to pull away, to run, to scream, but my legs felt like lead. The man, the other me, stood there, smiling that same unsettling smile, his eyes glimmering with something I couldn't quite place. You didn't listen, he said softly. His voice was like a distant echo, both familiar and alien at the same time. You thought you could run from it. But here you are. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. But everything about this moment, the way the world felt like it was pressing in on me, the way his voice echoed in my mind, told me it was. I was standing here, face to face with myself. What do you want? I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my skull. Why are you doing this? He tilted his head, studying me, his gaze almost pitying. You're not ready to understand yet, are you? You spent your life running from what you are. From what we are. I shook my head, trying to block out the growing sense of panic. I don't know what you mean. I'm just me. Just a regular guy. His laugh was low, almost mocking, and the sound sent a chill down my spine. No, Mark. You're not just anyone. You're a reflection of what could have been. What could have been better. He stepped closer, and I stumbled back, my heart racing faster now. You don't belong here, I whispered, more to myself than to him. You're not real. You can't be. He stopped moving, his eyes narrowing. What do you think reality is, Mark? Just because you see it, touch it, feel it, doesn't mean it's real. Everything you know, everything you've built your life around, it's all just one version of the truth. And now you've seen another. I felt dizzy. The world around me seemed to blur, the station lights casting long, ghostly shadows on the cracked pavement. I couldn't think straight anymore. My mind was collapsing under the weight of his words. Why now? I whispered, barely able to comprehend what was happening. Why did you choose now to show up? His lips curled into a cruel smile. Because it's time. Time for you to wake up. Time for you to face the truth about who you really are. I stepped back again, my breath shallow. I don't want to wake up. I want this to end. I want it all to stop. His eyes softened for a moment, like he was almost sad for me. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened again. You don't have a choice. This is who you are now. The man who was never truly content with his life. The one who was always searching for something more. I was shaking now, my knees barely able to hold me up. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly broke through, a cold, suffocating wave of terror flooding my chest. What happens now? I asked, my voice trembling. What do you want me to do? His smile faded, and for a brief moment, I saw something else in his eyes, something darker. You need to make a choice, Mark. A choice that will decide who you really are. The train's low hum echoed in the distance, the only sound in the eerie silence between us. The shadows around us seemed to stretch, lengthening like dark fingers reaching out from the corners of my vision. Everything was closing in, and I couldn't breathe. I don't understand, I whispered. What choice? He stepped closer again, so close I could feel his cold breath on my skin. The choice to live as you are, as you've always been. Or to let go of the life you've built. To accept what you really are, and see the truth. I took another step back, my mind racing, my thoughts spiraling. He wasn't just a mirror of me. He was a version of me that had chosen differently. A version that hadn't settled for the ordinary, the predictable. And now, he was standing here, asking me to choose between the life I knew and the life I could have had. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the world around me seemed to fade in and out of focus. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was real anymore. What happens if I refuse? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't hesitate. Then you'll keep living this lie. You'll keep wandering through your days, never knowing the truth. Never understanding what could have been. I felt a tightness in my chest, the overwhelming weight of his words pressing down on me. The fear was suffocating, and yet there was something else, something deeper, stirring within me. I wasn't sure if it was hope or desperation, but something urged me forward toward the choice he was presenting. Maybe this was my chance to break free, to become something more. But what would that cost me? I didn't know if I was ready to make that choice. Not yet. With shaking hands, I took a step back, the distance between us widening, my breath catching in my throat. I can't. I don't know if I'm ready. The other me didn't look disappointed. Instead, he nodded as if he had expected this. It's okay, Mark. You'll find your way. One day, you'll have to make the choice. And when that time comes, I'll be here. Waiting. I watched as he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the station. And then, just like that, he was gone. I was left standing there, in the empty, quiet station, alone with my thoughts. The fear had subsided, replaced by an unsettling sense of uncertainty. Was he right? Was I living a lie? I didn't know what to think anymore. I didn't know if I could ever be the same again. But one thing was certain, my life would never be the same after tonight. Have you ever felt like someone is watching you? Like you're being observed even when no one's around? For months now, I've felt that way. It started as a small thing, something so subtle I almost dismissed it. Every morning, when I went out for my run, there was a man standing by the dumpster behind my house. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, he wasn't loitering or staring at me. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on something in his hands. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just waiting for something, or maybe he was simply passing by. But then it became clear that he was always there, like a fixture. Same spot, same time, every single morning, as regular as my daily routine. He wasn't anyone I recognized. His clothes were old, worn jeans and a faded jacket that had seen better days. His hair was messy, and his face, well, his face was hard to read. He seemed tired, maybe even lost, but there was something about the way he stood, so still, that unnerved me. He never acknowledged me, never moved, not even a glance in my direction. He was detached, absorbed in whatever he held in his hands. It was always the same thing, a small, worn-out object. It was hard to make out from where I stood, but I could see enough to know it wasn't trash. It didn't belong with the garbage around him. And every day, when I passed, I felt an unease in the pit of my stomach. I began to wonder, who is he? Why is he always there? What is he doing? The unease turned into curiosity. Each morning, as I ran past the alleyway that led to the dumpster, I found myself glancing over, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that he held. But the object always remained hidden from view, just out of reach, like it was a secret he was keeping from me. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I was overthinking it. After all, it's just a man by the dumpster. But then, something happened. One morning, as I was heading back from my run, I saw him again. He was standing in the same spot, his back to me, the object still clutched tightly in his hands. This time, though, something was different. There was no trash. The dumpster, which had always been full of bags and scraps, was empty. It was just him, standing there, holding that object. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew I had to stop. I had to know what he was holding. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something harmless. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I slowed my pace, my heart racing in my chest. Should I approach him? Was it safe? Every part of me screamed not to, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I couldn't let it go. I took a deep breath and crossed the street, heading toward the alley. The man didn't move. He didn't seem to notice me at all. What if he's dangerous? What if he's not who he seems to be? But I couldn't stop now. I was too close. As I reached the alley, my pulse quickened. The man remained still, his attention fixed on the object in his hands. I stopped just a few feet away, my breath caught in my throat. What was it? And then, in one swift motion, he turned. I didn't have time to move. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, it felt like the world had stopped. It wasn't anger or fear in his gaze, but something colder. Something older. Something that made my stomach churn. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look surprised that I was standing there. He simply lifted the object toward me, and that's when I saw it. It was a locket. A small, silver locket. A locket I had lost months ago. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the familiar shape, the intricate design on the surface. The same one I had searched high and low for, convinced it was gone forever. The locket that had belonged to my mother. How did he have it? How could he have it? I felt my legs go weak, the world around me spinning. I wanted to scream, to demand answers. But the words wouldn't come. I could barely breathe as I stared at the locket in his hands. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, waiting. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said something I will never forget. "Do you want it back?" The question echoed in my mind, and for a moment everything felt distant, like I was floating outside of my own body. Do I want it back? The thought seemed simple enough. Of course, I wanted it back. But the moment the words left my lips, I realized something terrifying. He had been waiting for me. To come closer. To ask. To see. And as I stood there, frozen in place, I realized that nothing about this was by chance. This man, this stranger, had been watching me. Waiting. Perhaps for weeks. Perhaps even longer. And now, it was too late to turn back. I didn't take the locket from him. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, stuck in that moment where everything felt wrong. My mind raced, but no words would form. He continued to hold it out, unmoving. The silver gleamed in the dim light of the alleyway. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You've been looking for this, haven't you?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure if he meant the locket or something else. Something deeper. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice shaky. I barely recognized it as my own. I had so many questions, but none of them felt right to ask. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch between us, thick and suffocating. Then, almost casually, he dropped the locket into the palm of his hand, closed his fingers around it, and slowly began to turn away. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said, almost pleading. "Please." He turned his head just slightly, enough to make eye contact. His gaze was steady, unflinching. There was a quiet certainty in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place, but that sent another chill down my spine. "You want to know," he said, almost like a statement. "You want to know how I have it, don't you?" I swallowed hard. "Yes." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, in a voice that seemed too calm, too detached, he said, "I've been here longer than you think. Longer than you know. Watching. Waiting." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The words didn't make sense. How could he have been there longer than me? I had lived in this house for years, and I had never seen him before. Never. But something inside me, something deep and buried, told me that this was no accident. This man, standing here before me, knew far more than he was letting on. "I don't understand," I whispered. He stepped back, his gaze still locked on mine, the locket still hidden in his hand. "It's not about what you understand. It's about what you remember." I didn't have time to process what he meant before he turned, his figure disappearing into the shadows of the alley. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the air heavy with unanswered questions. I wanted to run after him, demand answers, but something held me back. It was like my legs wouldn't obey me. As I stood in that eerie silence, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. The man had known about the locket. He had known that I had lost it. But how? And why was he standing by my dumpster every day? It was as if he had been waiting for me to notice him, to approach him. But why? And then another thought hit me with a force I couldn't ignore. What if this was not the first time he had been here? What if he had been in my life longer than I realized? What if the moments I had dismissed, those small, strange occurrences, were all connected to him? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. I needed answers. I needed to understand. I turned and walked quickly back to my house, but as I reached the door, a cold shiver ran through me. There, lying on the ground by the doorstep, was something that shouldn't have been there. A small, folded piece of paper. I bent down slowly, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. Unfolding it, I saw that it was a note, no words, just one simple image drawn in black ink. A locket. The same locket that man had been holding. But this time, it wasn't in his hand. It was in mine. I stumbled back, the breath catching in my throat. My head spun as I looked around, but there was no one there. No sign of the man. Only the paper and the unmistakable feeling that somehow he was always one step ahead of me. Something had shifted. Something inside me felt different, like the world around me was no longer the same. And as I stood there, staring at the drawing, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't escape this. Not anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face. His eyes, those cold, emotionless eyes, stared back at me, unwavering. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, even though I had closed the door behind me. The note with the locket was sitting on my kitchen table, its presence a constant reminder of the bizarre encounter. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, that the man was just some random person with a strange habit, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something more to this. Something I wasn't seeing yet. I spent the rest of the night going over every detail of the encounter. The way he stood by the dumpster, how he never looked at me, how the object in his hands remained hidden from view. I couldn't get the image of the locket out of my mind. How had he known about it? How had he known it was mine? The more I thought about it, the more questions surfaced. The man wasn't just some stranger. He was part of something connected to me. But what? And why? The morning came too soon. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go back to the dumpster. I needed to see it for myself, to understand what was happening. I had to find him again. I had to confront him. I forced myself to get dressed and go for my usual run, though it felt like I was walking straight into a trap. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows on the street as I made my way to the alley. The dumpster was there, but the man wasn't. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Had he just been a figment of my imagination? Or was this just another game he was playing with me? I walked slowly toward the dumpster, scanning the area. There was nothing unusual, no sign of him, no trace of the strange presence that had filled the air yesterday. But as I passed the dumpster, I noticed something on the ground, half buried in the dirt and trash. It was the same locket. The very same one he had been holding. I knelt down, my heart racing, and picked it up. This time, there was no question about it. The locket was unmistakable, the same intricate design, the same delicate chain. It felt cold in my hand, like it had been lying there for ages. I turned it over and saw something written on the back. It wasn't in a language I recognized, just a series of symbols, too faint to make out completely. The writing seemed to shimmer in the early morning light, almost as if it was alive. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of it. What was happening? Why was this locket appearing everywhere I went? I stood up quickly, looking around. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling as I gripped the locket tightly. I had to get away from here, but the thought of going back to my house was unbearable. Something told me that the man, whoever he was, wasn't far behind. I couldn't stay in the same place any longer. Not while this feeling of being watched was so strong. I ran, my legs moving faster than I thought possible, until I reached my house. I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I looked out the window, expecting to see the man standing in the yard, but there was no one there. The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that filled every corner of the house, wrapping around me like a thick fog. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The more I thought about the locket, the more I realized it had become something more than just an object. It was a symbol, a key to something I didn't understand. As I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands still clutching the locket, I remembered something. Something small, buried in the back of my mind. I had seen this before. Not the locket itself, but the man. His face. His eyes. Years ago, my mother had given me that locket. She had told me it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. She had said something about it being special, that it held memories and secrets that were tied to our past. I had never really understood what she meant. But now I was beginning to wonder if she had known something I didn't. The memory flashed in my mind, vivid and clear. My mother had always told me to keep the locket safe. She had warned me that it was dangerous to lose it. She had said that one day, someone might come looking for it. And now, that someone had found me. I couldn't just sit here. I needed to find out more. I needed to know what this locket meant and why the man was looking for it. But as I looked at the locket in my hand, I realized something else, something even more terrifying. What if he wasn't the only one searching for it? The more I thought about the locket, the more it seemed like a piece of something I couldn't fully comprehend, something old, something buried. The symbols on the back, the man who had appeared out of nowhere, and the way the locket kept showing up as if it were a key to some dark, hidden past. It was all connected. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into a dark abyss, and I had no choice but to step forward. I couldn't sit around anymore. My mind wouldn't let me rest until I understood. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I pulled the locket from my pocket, examining it once more, running my fingers over the engraved symbols. It looked so ordinary at first glance, so delicate and beautiful. But now, it felt like something far more sinister, as though it carried the weight of years of secrets and warnings. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I hadn't seen anyone since the man in the alley, and yet there was someone at my door. I hesitated for a moment, the locket in my hand feeling impossibly heavy. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to let anyone inside, especially not with everything going on. But my legs moved before my mind could make a decision. I crossed the room and slowly opened the door. Standing there was a man. Not the same man from the alley, but someone close enough that it made my blood run cold. His face was unfamiliar, but there was something about him, something in the way he looked at me, that felt all too familiar. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice low and calm, but with an edge of something I couldn't place. "I'm looking for someone. I believe you may have something that belongs to me." I felt the blood drain from my face as his eyes briefly flicked to my hand, where the locket was still clenched tightly. I instantly wanted to pull it back, hide it, but somehow I couldn't move. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, scanning my face as though he were reading me, looking for something. "I don't think you understand," he said quietly, "but you've been holding on to something far more dangerous than you realize." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The words felt stuck in my throat, choked by a rising wave of dread. His gaze seemed to pierce through me, as if he were seeing things I didn't even know about myself. "I'm not here to hurt you," he continued, his voice softening, but there was no warmth in it. "I just need the locket." I closed my hand around it tighter, almost instinctively. The way he spoke, the way he knew about the locket, it was as if he knew more than I did, and that thought terrified me. "Who are you?" I repeated, trying to find my voice again. He hesitated, glancing behind him as though checking to see if anyone else was watching. He took another step closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "You don't remember me, do you?" His words were thick with an unfamiliar sadness, as though they carried the weight of years of lost time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart was racing, and I felt the panic creeping back in. I wanted to slam the door in his face, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, and the air around us grew heavy. "I'm the one who found you," he said, his voice now almost a sigh. "I've been watching. You've had the locket all this time, and you don't even know why you're holding it." I stared at him, my mind racing. Something about his words, the way he spoke, felt like an old wound reopening. His presence was suffocating, like something from my past that I had long forgotten. "I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say, my breath ragged. The man gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "You don't remember, but you will. I've waited too long for this. The locket, it's tied to everything. Your life. Your family. And now, it's time." His voice was strangely calm now, but the finality of his words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't breathe. Something about this situation felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. The air was thick with the sense that everything was closing in on me. The man stepped back slightly, looking at me one last time with an unreadable expression before turning to leave. But just before he stepped off the porch, he paused and turned his head back toward me. "You're not safe here," he said, his tone almost gentle, as if he were giving a warning, not a threat. "You never have been." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing in the doorway, feeling more alone than I had ever felt before. The moment he was gone, I realized just how much I didn't understand. Everything he had said, the locket, my family, the waiting, it felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't even begin to assemble. But I knew one thing for sure now. I wasn't just dealing with a man. I was dealing with something far older, far darker than I had ever imagined. And the truth, whatever it was waiting for me. Somehow, I knew I couldn't escape it. Not anymore. The silence in my house was deafening after the man left. His words echoed in my mind, each one reverberating like a distant warning. "You're not safe here. You never have been." I couldn't shake them off. They clung to me, twisting in my thoughts, making my pulse race, making my skin prickle with fear. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I did so. I didn't know what to do. The man had been so calm, so certain about everything. And then there was the locket, this small, delicate thing that seemed to be at the heart of everything. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a key to something I didn't understand, something that had been buried in my past. I had to know more. There was only one place I could go for answers. The attic. My mind screamed against the idea. The attic had always been off limits in my house. It was full of old boxes, forgotten things, memories of a past I had never wanted to revisit. But now, I had no choice. The man, the locket, the cryptic warning, it all pointed to something in my past, something hidden up there. I climbed the creaky stairs slowly, my feet hesitant, as though the house itself was reluctant to let me in. The attic door loomed before me, a dark shape at the end of the hall. I reached out and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dust-covered room filled with old furniture and boxes stacked high. The air was thick with age, and the faint smell of something musty and forgotten lingered in the corners. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The room was dark, lit only by the pale light filtering through a small window. Dust particles danced in the beams, giving the space an eerie, almost otherworldly feel. I took a deep breath, then began rummaging through the boxes. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but something told me that whatever it was, I would know it when I found it. It was like I was searching for a missing piece of myself, something that had been hidden away for too long. After what felt like an eternity, I came across an old wooden chest. It was smaller than the others, tucked away in a corner, almost as if it had been intentionally hidden. I ran my fingers over the surface, tracing the intricate carvings on the wood. They were familiar, too familiar, like a memory I couldn't quite reach. I opened the chest. Inside, there were several old papers, some yellowed and brittle with age, but most importantly, there was a small velvet pouch. I took a deep breath and reached inside. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. When I pulled it out, my breath caught in my throat. It was the same locket. The exact same one. I turned it over, my hand shaking as I examined it. The symbols on the back, those same faint, shimmering markings, glowed softly in the dim light of the attic. The locket felt heavier in my hand, as if it were more than just an object. It was a part of something larger, something that had been waiting for me to find it. As I held it, the memories began to flood back. My mother. Her warnings. The way she had always kept the locket close, never letting it out of her sight. The strange things she had said about it, about how it was more than just a piece of jewelry. How it held secrets. How it could never fall into the wrong hands. I realized then what had been missing from my memory. My mother had never told me what those secrets were. She had kept them from me, and now, all these years later, I was facing the consequences of that. I closed my eyes, clutching the locket tightly, and allowed the memories to come rushing back. The warnings, the fear in her eyes, the way she had told me to never let it go. But it was too late for that now. The man, whoever he was, had already found me. He had been watching me. And now, he was waiting. A chill ran down my spine. I could feel it. He wasn't far away. The man had said I wasn't safe. He had been right. I had never been safe. I looked down at the locket once more. The symbols were clearer now, the markings almost glowing. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight, and I was finally beginning to see it. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a map, a guide. And the man wasn't the only one looking for it. There were others. Others who had been waiting for it to resurface. And I was the key. The key to something ancient. Something powerful. I had to make a choice. I could run. I could hide. I could leave everything behind and disappear. But I knew it wouldn't matter. As long as I had the locket, they would find me. The man, the others, they would never stop. Or I could face it. I could confront whatever was coming for me, whatever had been waiting for so long. I didn't have much time. The man's words had been clear. The locket is tied to everything. And now, I had to decide if I was ready to uncover what that truly meant. As I held the locket in my hand, I realized that the only way to survive this was to face the truth. No matter how terrifying it was. The past had come calling. And now, there was no escaping it. It was a quiet night. Too quiet, perhaps. The kind of night where the absence of sound weighs heavier than any noise could. I was patrolling the usual stretch of road, nothing special, just keeping an eye out like I'd done every night for the past 2 years. The glow of my headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and empty streets. I had no reason to expect anything unusual tonight. But then it came. The call. Unit 721, come in. I glanced down at my radio, which crackled with static before the voice came through again. Unit 721, come in. Over. I pressed the button on my radio, responding automatically. 721 here. What's the situation? There was a brief pause. Just long enough for me to begin questioning the signal. Then the voice came through again. It sounded distorted, as if the person on the other end was struggling to be heard over static, but I could make out the words clearly enough. Requesting backup. Something's not right. Need assistance, near the old mill. Over. The old mill. It was on the outskirts of town, a place people rarely went anymore. I'd heard rumors about it, about strange noises at night, strange figures moving in the shadows. But those were just stories, right? No one took them seriously. I checked my rearview mirror. The road behind me was clear. I turned the wheel slightly, heading towards the mill. The further I drove, the darker the night became, as if the world itself was closing in. I could see the old mill in the distance now, its silhouette barely visible against the sky, abandoned and eerie. As I got closer, I expected to see flashing lights or maybe even another squad car. But there was nothing. No sign of another officer, no evidence of any incident. Only the mill stood like a dark, looming figure. I slowed down, then stopped at the edge of the property. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. My breath formed a visible mist in the cold air. Unit 721 to dispatch. I'm at the mill. No sign of activity. Over. Static. Unit 721, please respond. Over. I pressed the button again, but no reply came through. A shiver ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight beam dancing across the old stone walls of the mill. The building looked abandoned, but something about it felt off. like I was being watched. I approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. The hinges creaked as I pushed it open. The inside of the mill was dark, the only light coming from the beam of my flashlight. Dust hung in the air, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. The place smelled of decay, of something forgotten. I moved further into the building, the sound of my footsteps the only noise. Then I stopped. There was something on the floor in front of me. It was a uniform. A police uniform. At first, I thought I was seeing things. My heart skipped a beat. I crouched down to get a closer look. It was my uniform. The same jacket, the same badge, everything. But it was abandoned here, in the middle of the mill's floor, as if someone had just dropped it and walked away. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. My radio crackled again. Unit 721, where are you? Over. I grabbed the radio, my voice shaky as I responded, I'm inside the mill. I found. A sound interrupted me. A soft scuffle. It came from somewhere deep inside the mill. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I turned my flashlight towards the sound, but it was too late. The beam caught only the shadows of the room, stretching and twisting like dark, formless shapes. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness. Slow. Measured. They were coming closer. I wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, each step deliberate, echoing through the mill like a drumbeat in my chest. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My flashlight flickered slightly, casting strange shadows on the cracked walls, but I still couldn't see anything clearly. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, it was coming closer. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. The heavy air felt thick, suffocating. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but the sound of the footsteps was now so close, I could almost feel the presence behind me. I took a cautious step back, my heart racing. Who's there? My voice was louder than I wanted it to be. There was no answer, only the soft scrape of boots against wood. The sound was unmistakable, human footsteps. I shifted my stance, aiming my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam caught only the edges of the mill's interior. I could see broken beams, torn curtains swaying in the faint draft, and the piles of old machinery, but there was no one in sight. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence followed, stretching the tension to its breaking point. My hand trembled as I reached for my radio, hoping for some kind of response. Unit 721, this is dispatch. Do you copy? Over. I almost shouted into the radio, desperate for some kind of guidance. Dispatch, this is Unit 721. I've got a problem. I'm inside the mill. Someone, or something, is here. Over. Static. I repeated myself, but there was no reply. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears. I could feel the sweat trickling down the back of my neck. Whatever this was, it was not normal. I had to get out of here. But how? How could I leave while I was so deep inside? And what was waiting for me in the darkness? The sound of shuffling feet came again, closer now, as if circling around me. I spun in place, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the room. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the walls, the abandoned machines, the stale air. Then, movement. A shadow shifted across the far corner of the room, darting too quickly for me to fully track. My breath caught in my throat. There was someone there. I backed up, my back pressing against the rough wood of the mill's wall. The flashlight wavered in my hands as I tried to stay calm, my mind racing for a plan. "Hello?" I called out, trying to make my voice firm, though fear twisted it into something weaker than I intended. "Who's there?" The shadow didn't answer, but the footsteps resumed. Closer this time. I could hear them behind me, no longer distant, but right there, just beyond my line of sight. Then, I saw it. Just a flicker at first, a figure in my flashlight's beam. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. It was a man, standing motionless in the center of the room. A man wearing a police uniform. But not just any uniform, my uniform. It was me. The same face, the same build, but the expression was wrong. Hollow. Empty. The man in front of me wasn't alive, not in the way I was. His eyes were dull, like those of a corpse. He was standing, watching me, as if waiting for something. Or maybe someone. My body screamed at me to run, to leave, but my feet refused to move. I was frozen, staring at this impossible reflection. The man, or thing, was wearing my uniform, down to the smallest details, my badge, my name tag. But there was something wrong about the way he stood. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like a mannequin that had come to life. Then he moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, he lifted his arm. And in his hand, he was holding something. I gasped. It was my radio. The one I'd been using moments ago. It was as though the world had stopped spinning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Ow! Why was he holding my radio? How did he? Unit 721, the voice crackled through the radio. My voice. Coming from the man in the uniform. The words hit me like a slap to the face. Requesting backup, his voice repeated. Need assistance. I tried to speak, to move, but the words caught in my throat. The shadow in front of me slowly tilted its head, its eyes locking onto mine with a cold, lifeless gaze. Suddenly, everything around me seemed to fade. The walls, the machines, the stale air, they all blurred into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the man standing before me. The man who was supposed to be me. The footsteps stopped again, and I heard a distant echo in the dark. The sound of more footsteps, many footsteps, closing in on me from all directions. I was trapped. And the man who looked like me was no longer waiting. He took a step forward, holding the radio to his mouth, his hollow voice echoing in the mill's cold silence. The last words I heard before everything went black were chilling. Requesting backup. I don't know how much time passed before I regained consciousness. The cold floor beneath me felt like a shock to my system as I slowly pushed myself up, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My head pounded, and my vision was blurry. I blinked several times, trying to clear the fog. But all I could see was darkness, except for the faintest glow from my flashlight still lying just out of reach. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and fumbled until I finally grabbed the beam. The light flickered and dimmed, casting erratic shadows that stretched across the room. The man, or thing, was gone. I didn't know if I should feel relief or more terror. The air was thick, suffocating, and the silence around me was deafening. My heart was still racing in my chest, and I had to focus, gather my thoughts. I couldn't allow panic to control me. I had a job to do, and I needed to get out of there. I checked my radio again. No response. Not a single word from dispatch. Not even static. I pressed the button several times, hoping for some sort of communication, but the device remained dead in my hands. With my flashlight as my only source of light, I cautiously stood and began walking. Every creak of the building beneath me made my skin crawl. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me with their dark, oppressive presence. The mill was even more unsettling now. The machinery that had once seemed abandoned now seemed to watch me, its rusted gears and belts turning in ways they shouldn't, creaking with the weight of time and decay. And then, from somewhere far behind me, came the sound of a door creaking open. I froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, like the turn of an old, rusted knob. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. Nothing but the emptiness of the mill. And the cold, biting air. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of here. But how could I leave when I didn't know who or what was following me? The footsteps. The man who looked like me. Everything felt wrong. The world felt wrong. I moved quickly now, my boots slapping against the concrete as I sprinted for the exit. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to escape whatever was lurking in the dark, but it felt like the walls themselves were closing in around me. I reached the entrance. The old wooden door was still ajar, just like when I entered, but as I approached it, something stopped me. The air shifted. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, rustled through the mill. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded familiar. It sounded like my own voice. I turned back, heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight danced nervously across the dark interior, and that's when I saw it, an imprint in the dust. A footprint. A fresh footprint. Someone, or something, was standing right behind me. I didn't turn to face it. I couldn't. Instead, I bolted for the door. My breath came in ragged gasps as I forced the heavy wood open, my fingers numbed and slick with sweat. I shoved my way through, stumbling out into the cold night air. The chill hit me like a slap to the face. I was free, almost. As I ran, the darkness seemed to follow me, creeping just outside my vision, like a shadow that refused to leave. My mind raced. What had I just encountered? Was it some twisted game? A nightmare? Or was there something much darker at play here? And then, just as I reached my patrol car, I heard it. A voice. A voice I knew all too well. Coming from behind me. Requesting backup. It was my voice again. But this time, it didn't come from the radio. It came from the very air around me. The voice echoed in the wind, the words clear as day. I whipped around, my flashlight flashing frantically over the empty mill. Nothing was there. Nothing but the echo of my own voice, swirling around me like the cold mist rising from the ground. My pulse raced. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I grabbed my radio again, pressing the button desperately. Unit 721 to dispatch. Do you copy? Over. There was a pause, then a crackle. Then, my own voice, once more, sounding from the radio. Requesting backup, it said. And then, the voice softened, the static growing thick with distortion. It's too late, officer. The radio went silent. I stood frozen, unable to move. The wind howled in my ears, the last remnants of the voice fading into the night. I had to get away. I had to leave, to drive as far as I could. But part of me, deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, wondered if it was already too late. If something had already taken hold of me. I glanced back at the mill one last time, the blackened windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. It didn't matter where I went. What if the man in my uniform was already there, waiting for me? What if the world I knew was not the one I was living in anymore? I slammed the door of my patrol car shut and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure who or what I had just encountered. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to stop running. I drove as fast as I could, my hands tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The patrol car's headlights illuminated the empty road ahead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The wind outside howled, pushing against the car with a force that made it feel like the night itself was trying to swallow me whole. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing me. I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the headlights of another car. But there was nothing. Just a pitch-black road stretching out behind me, empty and desolate. I swallowed hard and focused on the road ahead. My breath was shallow, panicked. I couldn't let my mind wander. I had to get to a safe place, somewhere with people, somewhere where I could be sure that whatever had been stalking me in that mill wasn't going to follow me. The thought of the voice on the radio sent a chill down my spine. My own voice, asking for backup. But I had never said it. The words were a twisted echo of something that had already happened, or something that was yet to happen. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to push the thought from my mind. I needed to focus. I had a job to do. But the words "It's too late, officer," still echoed in my ears. And then, without warning, my radio crackled to life again, requesting backup. I froze, my foot slamming on the brake. My heart skipped a beat. The voice came through the static again, my voice. But it was distorted, hollow, like it had been stripped of all humanity. I grabbed the radio, hands shaking. "Dispatch? This is Unit 721. Do you copy?" The radio buzzed again, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else, a low, guttural sound, something too deep to be human. It was followed by my voice, but it sounded wrong. Twisted. "It's too late." I slammed the radio off, my breath coming faster now. My head was spinning. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Was I hearing things? Or was something else out there, something that shouldn't be? I pressed the gas pedal harder, the car surging forward. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror once more, and that's when I saw it. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow cast by the trees lining the side of the road. But as I blinked, the figure grew clearer. A man. The same height, the same build as me. And he was running. Running after me. I swerved the car to the side of the road, the tires screeching in protest. My heart raced as I glanced back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was gaining on me, its long limbs moving unnaturally fast, too fast for any person to run. It was keeping up with me, matching my speed as I floored the pedal. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the figure was still there. Its face was just out of view, but I could see the outline of the uniform. It was wearing the same uniform I wore. It looked like me. And that's when I realized. It was me. My stomach churned, nausea flooding my senses. My own reflection, my own doppelganger, was chasing me, running beside the car, staying just out of reach, as if it were toying with me. I could feel it, though. It wasn't just my body running, it was something else that was pulling me forward. Some part of me that wasn't in control anymore. I tried to focus on the road, but every time I glanced in the mirror, the figure was closer. It wasn't stopping. It wasn't going away. Suddenly, the headlights of the patrol car flickered. The engine sputtered, and the car jerked violently before losing speed. My heart dropped. No. No, 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 I muttered to myself, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. I pumped the gas pedal, trying to restart the engine, but it was no use. The car came to a full stop, and the engine died completely. I sat there for a moment, breathless, staring ahead. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears, and all I could hear was the sound of footsteps growing nearer. The figure was almost at the window now. I turned to the side, my hands trembling as I reached for my gun. My grip was tight, but I could barely control the shaking in my fingers. This wasn't a person. This wasn't a criminal I could arrest. This was something else. The figure stopped just a few feet from the car. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I could see its outline now, clear and solid, standing in the beam of the car's dimmed headlights. It tilted its head, slowly. The darkness behind it seemed to move, swirling like a storm. I couldn't tell where the figure began and where the night ended. It was as though it had merged with the shadows, becoming one with the darkness. And then, in a voice that wasn't my own, but was somehow still familiar, it spoke. You should have never come back. The words froze me in place. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer. I didn't know if I was facing a ghost, a nightmare, or something far worse. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to make it out of this night alive. The figure's voice, my voice, echoed in the cold, empty night, each word carving its way into my mind like a jagged knife. I couldn't move. My limbs felt frozen, the cold creeping through my skin and into my bones. The world around me seemed to tilt, to warp, as if reality itself was starting to fray at the edges. You should have never come back. The voice repeated, this time softer, more menacing, as if it were trying to draw me in. I could feel its presence now, pressing against me, suffocating me with its unnatural weight. My hand gripped the gun tighter, but my mind screamed that it wouldn't help me. Nothing could help me. Not now. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped in that car, a sitting duck, watching as this thing, this version of me, stepped closer, inch by inch. And then, as if the night itself bent around us, the figure's face came into view. It was me. Or rather, it looked like me. But it was wrong. Its eyes, dark, empty pools, stared at me with a coldness that I had never felt in myself. The face was twisted, unnaturally still, but there was a cruelty in the way it looked at me, as if I were the stranger, not it. The air between us felt thick with tension. It smiled, a slow, mocking grin that didn't belong on a human face. It leaned closer to the window, and I could hear its breathing. Shallow, labored, as though it had been chasing me for miles, for days. You're not supposed to be here, it whispered, its voice like a serpent's hiss. You left. And you should have stayed gone. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. And then I heard it. A faint sound, like a soft rustling behind me. A breeze that wasn't there before. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The dark road, stretching endlessly behind me, was now lined with figures. Dozens of them, all wearing the same uniform. All standing perfectly still, their faces hidden in the darkness. My breath hitched. Were they all me? Were they all just like this, things standing beside my patrol car? I turned back to the figure in front of me. Its grin widened. "It's too late," it said, as if it were savoring the moment. "They're already here." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew what it meant. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just a twisted version of myself. This was something much bigger. A trap. A web closing on me, and I was the fly caught in it. The figure outside the car reached for the door. My heart stopped. "What do you want from me?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure paused, its hand inches from the door handle. For a moment, I thought it was going to speak again, to give me some kind of answer. But instead, it just tilted its head, as if considering me. And then, with a voice that was both mine and not mine, it whispered one final word. "Everything." Before I could react, it pulled the door open with ease, like it was made of nothing but air, and I was thrown back into the seat. My hand instinctively went to the gun again, but the figure was too fast. It grabbed my wrist, twisting it with a strength that no human should possess. I gasped, unable to move. The figure leaned in closer, its eyes inches from mine. I could feel its breath on my face, cold and unnatural. "You should have stayed gone," it repeated, its voice so much louder now, a roar in my head, drowning out everything else. The world around me began to crack, splintering apart, as if the reality itself couldn't hold the weight of whatever was happening. I could feel it, the collapse. Something was coming for me, something that wasn't just a nightmare anymore. It was real. The figure smiled once more, a twisted, grotesque expression, before it spoke one last time. "You never left. We're all here now." And just like that, everything went dark. I woke up to the sound of a distant siren. My hands shook as I slowly opened my eyes, the harsh light blinding me for a moment. I was in the car, but everything was wrong. The streets were empty, the world around me silent. I glanced at the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me. The figures were gone. I glanced at the radio. It was still on, static crackling softly. I grabbed it, desperate for something, anything, to make sense of this. "Unit 721 to dispatch," I said, my voice hoarse. There was no reply. Just the empty sound of static. I slammed the radio down in frustration and looked out the window again. The road stretched out in front of me, endless and silent. But I could feel it. The presence. The thing that had been chasing me. It wasn't gone. It was still there, just waiting. I didn't know how much time I had left. I didn't know if I could ever escape. I only knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Have you ever arrived somewhere, expecting life to go on as usual, only to find the world strangely silent, unnervingly still? That's what happened to me one afternoon, and I still can't explain it. The question echoes in my mind, where did everyone go? I was driving through the countryside, taking a long, winding route to clear my head. The plan had been simple, just a quick stop to stretch my legs in a small town I'd never been to before. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, where the shopkeepers wave as you pass by, and the pace of life is slow. I didn't expect anything unusual. But when I arrived, something was off. The town was empty. At first, I thought maybe it was a holiday or some kind of local event I didn't know about. But no! Everything was wrong in a way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The streetlights flickered overhead, but there was no one walking beneath them. The storefronts were wide open, the merchandise untouched. There was a cafe with tables and chairs, but no one sitting there, not even a single person sipping coffee. The smell of fresh bread wafted from a bakery, yet no one was there to buy it. The cars parked along the street were all in place, but the engines were cold, unmoving. Everything was as if it were frozen in time, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. I stood by my car, the engine still running, my mind racing to find a logical explanation. Maybe a disaster had struck, something that cleared the place out in a hurry. Maybe a big event had started elsewhere. But none of these ideas seemed to make sense. I took a few steps forward, cautiously. The sound of my boots on the pavement seemed unusually loud, the only noise in the heavy silence. As I walked, I kept glancing around, expecting someone to appear, to break the stillness and tell me what was going on. But there was nothing. The buildings looked normal, the signs in the windows advertising local businesses, but it felt like they had been abandoned. No sounds of children playing, no laughter from an outdoor cafe. Nothing. Just the eerie hum of the wind, carrying with it the strange feeling that something was amiss. I walked further, past a newspaper stand with papers neatly arranged. One headline caught my eye, "Unexplained events continue to baffle locals." It was an old edition, the paper crinkled as if it hadn't been touched in days. I stood there, reading, feeling the weight of something deepening in my chest, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The more I walked, the more I felt it, like the town was staring at me, watching my every move. But no one was there. At one point, I came across a small park. The swings creaked slightly in the breeze, moving as if they were pushed by invisible hands. I looked around. Not a single person in sight. I tried calling out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice felt swallowed by the emptiness, lost before it reached the air. I found myself near the town square. A large fountain stood in the middle, its water flowing peacefully, yet not a single ripple from anyone's touch. The benches around the fountain were empty, untouched. It didn't make sense. Where were the people? Where was everyone? I felt my heart rate increase, my breath shallow. The quiet was deafening now. The peaceful town I'd expected to find seemed like a ghost town, frozen in time. It was as if I had walked into a place that didn't belong, like I had slipped through a crack in reality, into a place where the rules of life didn't apply. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but every time I turned, there was no one there. I was completely alone. It was then that I noticed it, a door at the edge of the square, half open, with a light flickering above it. I walked closer, drawn by the strange, magnetic pull. It felt wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open with a creak. Inside, the silence was even thicker, like the building had been deserted for years. I stepped inside cautiously, taking in the dim, dusty interior. Tables were scattered with empty cups, newspapers left on the counters, some with pages missing. And then I saw it. A single figure in the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, like a mannequin. I froze. My pulse raced in my ears. The figure was facing away from me, completely motionless. The room felt colder, the air heavy with anticipation. I approached it, each step dragging, hesitant. As I got closer, I saw the faintest hint of movement. The figure shifted, slowly, its head turning ever so slightly toward me. And in that instant, I felt something, I don't know what it was, grip my chest, pulling the air from my lungs. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I was in a town where time stood still, a place where no one seemed to exist, and yet here was a figure. A person? No. It couldn't be. I turned and ran. The door slammed behind me, and I heard a faint sound, a soft, almost inaudible whisper of movement coming from inside the building. My heart pounded, my mind racing for a reason, for something to explain what I had just seen. But the town held its breath, waiting. And I, too, was waiting for something to change. But nothing did. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place before whatever it was that was watching me closed in. I ran back to my car, the sense of unease growing with every step, my mind screaming that something was terribly wrong. But as I turned the key in the ignition, I saw it, the figure again, standing just at the edge of the square, staring at me. It didn't move. The car roared to life, and I sped away, my hands shaking on the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The town was still there, quiet, but it was behind me now, fading into the distance. The streets, the houses, the lifeless buildings. They were just part of the landscape now, a nightmare I couldn't escape. I couldn't shake the feeling that the town wasn't just empty. It was waiting for me to return. And somehow, deep down, I knew it would be waiting for me again. I couldn't get the image of that town out of my head. Every night, I would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the dull hum of the quiet world outside my window. The town without people, the figure standing motionless, it was all consuming. The more I tried to forget, the more vivid the memories became, like a puzzle that kept rearranging itself in my mind. It had been 3 days since I left the town, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The emptiness. The stillness. I tried to search for answers, but every attempt to find any information about that place ended in dead ends. Maps didn't mark it. Local people had no knowledge of it. Even online searches returned nothing, as if it had never existed. I told myself it was just a strange experience, a bizarre coincidence that I had wandered into an abandoned town for some reason. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something off. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up whenever I thought about it. That night, I couldn't resist. I had to go back. I needed to know what was happening there. Maybe, just maybe, I would find some explanation. Some logical reason for what I had seen. I packed a small bag, grabbed my car keys, and drove back through the familiar roads, the same ones I had taken just a few days ago. My heart raced with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Could it be the same town? Would it look the same, or had things changed? As I neared the turnoff, I saw the sign again, "Welcome to South Hollow." The letters on the sign looked weathered, as if they had been left untouched for years, but nothing had changed. The road stretched out in front of me, leading to the same town, the same eerie emptiness. The drive felt longer this time. It wasn't that the distance was greater, but it felt like the air had shifted, like time itself was dragging its feet. The trees on the roadside seemed to lean in toward me, their branches stretching into the darkness as though trying to warn me away. I arrived. The town was just as I had left it, still, quiet, lifeless. But this time, I wasn't turning back. I parked my car at the same spot where I had left it before. The silence pressed down on me like a heavy weight, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The wind whispered through the trees, but no other sound disturbed the stillness. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps too loud in the quiet. I took a slow, deliberate walk through the streets again, but this time I was focused. I wasn't going to let the overwhelming feeling of dread push me away. I had to know. I passed the bakery first, its door wide open, but there was no sign of anyone. Not even the faintest sign of life. I moved past the shops, glancing inside at the neat rows of products that remained untouched. The whole town felt like a stage set for some forgotten play, everything in place, but with no actors to bring it to life. It was as if it was waiting for something or someone to complete it. Then I heard it. A soft sound coming from the direction of the town square. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A rhythmic thumping, like footsteps in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same sound I had heard when I was here before, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the streets for the source. There was no one in sight. The square was empty, just like it had been the first time. But the sound kept getting louder, as if someone was walking toward me, getting closer. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the pounding in my chest growing louder than the mysterious footsteps. They were right behind me now. I spun around, and there he was. The figure. The same one from before. He stood at the edge of the square, facing me. This time, he wasn't just standing still. His head tilted slightly, his gaze fixed on me, his posture unnaturally stiff. I felt my throat tighten. There was no question, it was the same person. The same figure that had stood motionless in the corner of that building days ago. But this time, he wasn't frozen. He was watching me. Waiting. I took a step back, my mind racing. What did he want? What was this place? And why was it so empty? I tried to call out, but my voice barely broke the silence. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It felt as though I had stepped into a nightmare, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. The figure didn't move at first, but then, very slowly, he raised his hand. His fingers twitched, as if beckoning me closer. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as if I were caught in the grip of something beyond my understanding. For a long moment, we stood there in silence. Then, finally, I forced myself to take a step toward him. My legs felt heavy, my body reluctant, but I was drawn forward, unable to resist. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. In his hand, he was holding a small object. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I neared, I realized it was a key. A small, rusted key, like the kind that would open an old, forgotten door. The figure raised the key, and his lips parted, but no sound came from them. His eyes locked with mine, and for the first time, I saw something behind them. Something that wasn't human. A flicker of recognition. The figure wasn't a stranger at all. It was me. Or someone who looked exactly like me. The world tilted around me, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing, but everything inside me screamed that I needed to leave. I turned and ran. The footsteps, his footsteps, followed me. But I didn't look back. This time, I wasn't stopping. The figure, the town, everything about this place was too much. I needed to get out before it swallowed me whole. But as I raced away, one thought haunted me. Would I ever leave this place? Or was it waiting for me to return? The drive back felt like an eternity. I didn't know how long I had been driving, only that my hands were shaking on the wheel, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My mind was a swirl of confusion and fear. The figure, me, standing in the square, holding the key. It was too much to comprehend. I had escaped, but at what cost? The town, the silence, the strange feeling that had clung to me the entire time. I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't just wrong with the town, but wrong with me as well. The road felt longer than before. The shadows of the trees grew heavier with each passing mile, and the street lights above flickered sporadically, casting fleeting glimpses of light onto the empty road. My hands tightened around the wheel, the familiar motion of driving doing little to ease the tightening knot in my stomach. The thought of going home crossed my mind. I could turn back, forget the town, the figure, and everything that had happened. I could pretend it was just a bad dream, some bizarre hallucination brought on by stress. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't possible. I couldn't forget. It was like the town had branded itself into my soul, a scar that would never fade. As I neared my apartment, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The quiet of my own place would help, I told myself. I would lock the door, turn off the lights, and try to make sense of everything that had happened. I parked and walked up to my door, my keys cold in my hands. When I stepped inside, the emptiness of my apartment hit me. I closed the door behind me and flicked on the lights. The familiar surroundings felt distant, like I had stepped into a different life altogether. I dropped my bag by the door, my eyes scanning the room. Everything seemed off. There was an unnatural stillness, like the air itself had thickened, became harder to breathe. My gaze fell on the couch. A small object lay on the coffee table. A key. The same rusted key I had seen in the figure's hand. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't seen that key before. I hadn't brought it with me. I had never seen it in my apartment. My hands trembled as I walked toward it, picking it up. The cold metal felt heavier than it should have been, like it was made of something far more sinister than just iron. I turned it over in my hand, my mind racing. Could it be? Could it possibly have come from the town? Had I somehow brought it back with me without realizing it? I reached for my phone, my fingers slick with sweat as I unlocked it. I quickly typed the town's name into the search bar again, hoping for something, anything, that would explain what had happened. But the results were the same as before, nothing. Just an empty search, as if the town itself was slipping through the cracks of reality. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that the town wasn't done with me yet. It was like the town had crossed the boundary between its world and mine, dragging me into something that couldn't be undone. I turned the key over in my hand again. It was cold, unyielding, like the eyes of the figure who had given it to me. Suddenly, the lights flickered. I didn't even have time to react before they went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My breath hitched, and I reached instinctively for my phone, using its screen as a small beacon of light. But even as I stared at the dim glow, I felt something shift. The air was thick now, charged with a presence, a coldness that had no reason to be in my apartment. My pulse quickened. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. I turned to the window. Outside, the street was empty. No cars. No people. Nothing. The silence was unbearable. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. It moved across the far wall, disappearing into the darkness before I could fully focus on it. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy. The key. It was still in my hand. My knuckles white as I gripped it. I turned toward the door, a strange pull on my chest urging me to open it, to step outside. But I knew that if I did, I would be going back. Back to the town, to the place where things didn't make sense. The place where the figure, my doppelganger, waited for me. To the key that didn't belong to me, but had found its way into my hands. I couldn't stop myself. I knew I had to. But it wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something else, something darker that beckoned me forward. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling. Suddenly, the phone in my hand buzzed, breaking the silence. I glanced down at the screen, my blood running cold. A single message appeared. It was from an unknown number. "You're already here." My breath caught in my throat. The message didn't make sense. The words echoed in my mind over and over again. And then, as if I had crossed some invisible line, the air in the room thickened. I turned, and the shadow I had seen earlier was standing there, just a few feet away from me. The figure. Not outside the apartment. Inside. I could barely breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen, my body locked in place. The figure raised its hand slowly, and I saw the key in its palm. The key, my key. It was time to leave. I didn't think. I couldn't think. My body moved without my command, my heart pounding in my ears as I backed away from the figure. The shadow shifted in the dim light, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. The key, now held firmly in its hand, glinted coldly under the pale light of my phone. "Who are you?" My voice cracked, the words barely a whisper, yet they seemed to fill the room. But the figure didn't answer. It simply stepped forward. Each movement it made was unnervingly precise, as if it knew exactly where I would be even before I moved. Its steps were silent, but the air around it seemed to hum with a quiet energy that made my skin crawl. The figure paused, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, recognition? A reflection of something I could never truly see. A memory I couldn't place. It raised its hand, and the key shimmered in the dim light. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The key was a link. A connection. A bridge between the world I knew and the one I had just escaped, or had I ever truly escaped? "Where do you want me to go?" I whispered, almost to myself, my voice trembling. I didn't know if I was talking to the figure or to the thing that had been pulling at me ever since I first arrived in that town. For the first time, the figure moved its lips. It didn't speak, but its gesture was unmistakable. It pointed to the door. The pull was unbearable. My feet felt as though they had a mind of their own, taking slow, reluctant steps toward the door. My heart raced. My mind screamed at me to resist, but the compulsion was overwhelming. The key. The key had a power of its own. I had been holding it, but now it was holding me. The air in the room was thicker now, like walking through water. My hand hovered above the doorknob and my breath came faster, panic setting in. The figure stood still, watching me with its unnerving gaze. I took a deep breath. I can't go back, I thought. I can't. But even as the thought formed, I felt my fingers close around the knob, and with a force I couldn't resist, I twisted it open. The night air hit me like a physical blow, sharp and cold. I stepped outside, the world outside my apartment feeling wrong, distorted. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the empty street. The city felt like a dream, its familiar streets now foreign and strange. I knew the path ahead, but something was terribly off. There was no sign of the figure, but I felt it. It was there, in the space just beyond my vision, waiting, watching. No, I thought. I have to break free. I turned sharply, running down the street as fast as I could. The familiar surroundings of the city seemed to close in on me, suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs trembling as I pushed forward, past empty cars, past quiet shops with their windows agape, as if everything had been abandoned at once. But the feeling didn't go away. The key. It was still in my hand, cold and heavy. I reached the park, the place where everything had started. The place where I had first felt the pull, where the town's silence had first invaded my mind. The path seemed to stretch before me, endless and winding. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. My feet faltered, and I looked over my shoulder. There, just beyond the trees, I saw the figure again. It wasn't close, but I could feel it, like a shadow lurking at the edge of my sight. I broke into a sprint, the key now a weight I couldn't shake off. Every step felt as though I were running deeper into something, deeper into a nightmare that I couldn't escape. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, mimicking my own. No, not mimicking, matching. The cold wind stung my face as I ran, but the streets felt endless, looping back on themselves. No matter how many turns I took, the town seemed to draw me back. The path didn't lead me forward, it dragged me backward. Then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it, the square. The same square I had been in before, the place where I had seen the figure with the key. The key. I looked at it, my hand still clenched around it. And as my gaze fell on the familiar square, I realized something terrible. I wasn't escaping. I was being pulled back into the same place, over and over again. The figure stood at the center of the square, waiting for me, its silhouette now clearer than before. It didn't need to move. It didn't need to speak. The pull was stronger now than ever. And I knew, deep down, that I would never leave. Not physically, not mentally. The key had found me, and it would never let go. I took a step forward, my body moving of its own accord. The figure's shadow stretched across the ground, and the night swallowed me whole. I was home. Not in the apartment I had once known, but in a place that felt hauntingly familiar. The square. The town. But it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of people. My reflection stared back at me from every corner. Every person in the crowd had my face. But they weren't me. They never were. The key? It wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs. I had become just another shadow in a place I would never escape. And I knew this story would never end. Have you ever experienced a smell that you couldn't explain? One that lingered in the air, teasing your senses, yet you couldn't find its origin? What if that smell wasn't just a random oddity, but a warning? I've always found comfort in the familiar. My house was a sanctuary. Its creaky wooden floors, the faint scent of lavender from an old diffuser I kept in the corner, it was mine, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world outside. But one night, something changed. I walked into my living room and the air felt thick. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A sharp, acrid scent, a smell of smoke, permeated the room. It didn't feel like the lingering smell of a cigarette or something that had burned on the stove. No, this was different. It was a heavy, overpowering odor, almost like a fire that had recently been put out. My heart began to race as I glanced around. The windows were shut. The door was locked. There was no fire in sight. So why did it smell like smoke? I searched the house, checked every room, the kitchen, even the attic. Nothing. No source of the smoke. I shook my head, chalking it up to a moment of paranoia. I'd been working late, maybe the stress was getting to me. But the smell didn't go away. Each time I came home, it was there, just as strong, hanging in the air like an unwelcome visitor. I couldn't escape it. A few days passed before I started hearing whispers. At the grocery store, the barista at the coffee shop, people were talking about the same thing. The fire. People spoke in hushed tones, mentioning a fire that had consumed a house nearby many years ago. But they didn't know the details. They never spoke of who lived there or what had happened, only the smoke that filled the streets for days afterward. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. The smell had returned with more intensity, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I drove to the location of the old fire, the one everyone had been whispering about. It was a quiet street, with houses that all looked the same, neat and unassuming. But as I pulled up, a chill ran down my spine. The lot where the house had stood was now empty, overgrown with weeds and a few scattered stones. There was no evidence of fire. No burned remains. Just emptiness. But there was something odd. A faint trace of ash still lingered in the air, and as I stood there, I realized that the smell wasn't fading. It was growing stronger. My heart pounded. Then I noticed it. A small, charred object near the edge of the property, half buried in the dirt. My hand shook as I reached for it. When I picked it up, I almost dropped it in horror. It was a photo frame. Burned around the edges, but the image inside was still visible. It was a photo of my house. My home, standing perfectly in place as it had always been. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized something that made my blood run cold. The house in the picture was the one that had burned down. Suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had been looking at the house where I lived or the one that no longer existed. The house that had once burned. A soft breeze blew past me, carrying with it the scent of smoke, and for the first time, I understood some things from the past don't stay buried. They come back, lingering like a memory that refuses to be forgotten. The smell of fire, the ashes, it all began to make sense, and yet nothing made sense anymore. I was still holding the photo frame as I slowly turned around and walked back to my car. But I knew one thing for certain, the smoke would never leave. It wasn't just a memory. It was something far worse, something I couldn't outrun. The air felt thick, suffocating as I drove back to my house. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as the image of the burnt photo frame lingered in my mind. The feeling that something wasn't right, something far beyond the logical, gnawed at me. I tried to shake it off, but it was no use. The house, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a prison. When I got home, the scent of smoke was there, just like I had feared. It hung in the air like a shadow, unsettling in its familiarity. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that maybe it was just a coincidence, or perhaps I had traced the smell back to the photo too much. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't just paranoia. There was something about it, something real, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stepped inside, but the house seemed different, darker, even though the sun hadn't completely set. I could still hear the faint sound of the wind outside, but there was something else. Something quieter. A soft whisper, almost imperceptible, like a murmur just at the edge of hearing. I stood still, straining to hear it. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a feeling. A chill ran up my spine, and my pulse quickened. The whisper was coming from somewhere inside the house, but when I walked into each room, it vanished. The scent of smoke was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I could taste it in the back of my throat, a bitter reminder of the fire that was never supposed to return. My eyes darted around the room, and my heart skipped when I noticed something odd. The photo frame, the one I had found earlier, was now sitting on the kitchen counter. How did it get there? My fingers trembled as I reached for it, my mind racing. The moment I touched the frame, the smell of smoke intensified, choking me, filling my lungs with a sensation of heat that wasn't physically there. I nearly dropped the frame again as a wave of dizziness washed over me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. I thought about the fire, about the people who had lived in that house, and how no one seemed to know anything about them. It was as if their very existence had been erased. The fire had come out of nowhere, leaving nothing but ashes, and no one had ever explained it. But the photo frame, my photo frame, was here. It wasn't just a keepsake from a forgotten past, it felt like a warning. The burning smell that accompanied it wasn't random. Something had triggered it, and it wasn't just in my head. I suddenly felt a pressure in my chest, like the walls of the house were closing in on me. The quiet whisper was growing louder, and this time I could make out a word. One word that made my blood run cold: leave. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I grabbed the photo frame, clutching it tightly as though it could somehow protect me. The whisper, soft and eerie, seemed to echo in my mind, and I could hear it even when I wasn't listening. Leave. 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 I didn't know what I was running from, but I knew that if I stayed here any longer, I might never escape whatever had begun in that house. But I had to stay. I had to figure it out. Someone was trying to tell me something, and I wasn't going to run away. Not yet. The night was falling fast, but the unsettling feeling inside the house didn't let me rest. I should have called someone, maybe the police or a friend. I should have sought help. But something told me not to. Something whispered that this was my problem to solve, as if I were being pulled into a mystery that had no escape. I turned off all the lights, standing in the darkness of the living room, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. The smell of smoke was still there, stronger now, mixing with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic. It reminded me of the smell of charred wood after a fire, but it was different. More pungent. Almost like it was still burning, even though the flames were long gone. I looked at the photo frame in my hands again. The frame was old, the glass cracked, the edges blackened, as though it had been exposed to extreme heat. But I couldn't remember it ever looking like that before. In fact, I hadn't even seen the photo in years, if ever. Why had it suddenly reappeared? I sat down on the couch, staring at the photo, trying to remember. It was a picture of a house that looked almost identical to the one I was standing in. The same layout, the same windows, the same door. I felt a pang of recognition deep in my chest, but the memory wouldn't come. Then, I noticed something strange. The photo wasn't the only thing in the frame. Behind it was a slip of paper, folded neatly, as though it had been placed there deliberately. My hand shook as I unfolded it, and I read the words scrawled hastily in dark ink. "You're not alone. It will find you." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I dropped the paper in shock, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. What did it mean? Who had written this? And how did they know about me? Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder this time, almost as if it were breathing down my neck. "You're not alone. It will find you." I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing. The house was still, deathly still. But the air felt thicker now, heavier, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house. But the front door wouldn't open. I pulled at the handle with all my strength, but it didn't budge. I stepped back, my mind a whirl of panic, and turned to the windows. I rushed over to them, but they were locked too, as if someone had deliberately sealed me in. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a cage, trapping me in its dark, suffocating grip. The whisper was growing louder, and it felt like it was everywhere. I could hear it in the walls, the floor, the air itself. The smell of smoke had grown unbearable. It felt like I was suffocating in it. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my head in my hands. My vision blurred, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The air was too thick, the pressure too much. It was like the house itself was alive, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Coming from somewhere above me. I stood up shakily, trying to calm my breathing, my heart hammering in my chest. The house felt different now, like it had transformed into something else. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. The footsteps grew louder, closer. But no one was there. I had to leave. There was no more time to think. I had to get out before whatever this was trapped me forever. But when I turned to leave, I saw something else. The door, which had been locked moments before, was now open. It was as if the house was inviting me to walk into the unknown. I hesitated for a moment, but the sound of footsteps behind me made up my mind. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the hardwood floor as I rushed toward the front door. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, suffocating, clinging to my skin. The faint whispering in my ears wouldn't stop. It was like a constant hum, always just beyond my understanding, pushing me forward, urging me to escape. I reached the door, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath my trembling fingers. It wasn't locked anymore. The house seemed to be playing tricks on me, shifting and changing as I tried to make sense of it. I yanked the door open, stepping out into the cool night air. For a moment, I thought I was safe. I thought I had escaped whatever nightmare had trapped me inside. But the sense of wrongness didn't leave. In fact, it only grew stronger. I looked around, trying to gather my bearings. The street was empty. No cars, no people, just silence. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows stretching unnaturally long under the dim glow of the streetlights. And then I saw it. The house. The one that had once been mine, now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. But there was something even stranger about it now. The smoke still lingered in the air, even though no flames were visible. The structure was charred, collapsed, but its form was unmistakable. It was the same house. The one I had been living in. The one I thought I had just left. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the remnants of the building. How could this be? How could this house be burning while I was standing outside it, in the present? The smell of smoke intensified, wrapping itself around me. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. The same photograph from earlier, the one I had found in the frame, lay at my feet, half buried in the dirt. It was burnt, the edges curling, but it was still recognizable. The same house, the same photo. I picked it up, my fingers numb, trembling. I turned it over to see if the note was still there. The words, "You're not alone. It will find you," were still scrawled on the back. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, low and guttural. "You never left." I froze, the blood draining from my face. I turned around, but no one was there. My surroundings started to blur, like I was trapped in a dream. The street stretched before me, endless, and the silence deepened. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind me, slow and deliberate. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the space around me. "It will find you. You can't escape." I ran. My legs burned with the effort, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The empty street stretched endlessly before me, offering no escape. The houses, the buildings, the trees, they were all the same. Everything looked familiar, but there was something wrong, something off. I wasn't sure where I was anymore, or how long I had been running. I turned down a street, my eyes scanning frantically for anything that might offer a way out. But the world had become a blur of twisted shapes and darkened windows, as if I were running through a distorted mirror. My mind was spiraling. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Closer. Faster. A figure emerged from the shadows. I stopped dead in my tracks. A person. Or what looked like a person. Their face was obscured by a dark hood, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. They were walking, they were almost gliding, as if they didn't need to touch the ground at all. "You can't escape," the voice said again, but this time it was coming from the figure itself. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure moved closer, its presence like an oppressive weight pressing down on me. And then, as it reached out to touch me, I felt the ground beneath me shift. The earth seemed to tremble, the world tilting sideways, and I fell to the ground, unable to catch my balance. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the house. The smell of smoke was gone, but I knew I hadn't left. I hadn't escaped. I was trapped. And it was only a matter of time before it found me. I woke with a start, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. My head throbbed, and my pulse raced as if I had just sprinted miles. My surroundings were familiar, too familiar, but something felt distinctly off. I was back in the house. The walls, the furniture, the light that filtered through the curtains, they all looked the same as they had before the nightmare. But deep down, I could sense it. I wasn't truly back. I wasn't free. I sat up slowly, wiping my clammy palms on my jeans. The air was thick with an unsettling silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that weighs on you, suffocates you, makes you question if you're really alone. The house had a pulse now, an unnatural one, thudding beneath every creak of the floor, every rustle of the curtains. The same whispering voices I had heard earlier were faint, like an eerie hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to run as fast as I could, but I had no idea where to go. I didn't know what I was running from anymore. Then I noticed it. The photograph, the one I had found in the ruined house, was on the coffee table. I hadn't left it there. The house had changed, but it felt like time had also been around it. The photograph had returned. It was like a thread that tied me to this place, to this cycle, to whatever force had taken hold of me. I reached for the picture, turning it over in my hands. The back of it still held the same ominous message, "You're not alone. It will find you." Before I could even react, a noise from behind me stopped me cold. A soft, subtle shuffle, like footsteps. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty, darkened hallway leading into the kitchen. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, and the footsteps echoed again. This time, closer. As though someone, or something, was just behind me, waiting to strike. "It will find you." I whirled again. There, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, was the figure. The same one I had seen before. Its face was still hidden by the hood, but the outline of its silhouette was clearer now. The figure's hands twitched unnaturally at its sides. It was watching me, waiting. I backed away slowly, fear clawing at my chest. My mind raced, but my body felt frozen, as if it couldn't comprehend what was happening. The figure took one step forward, and I flinched. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a cold, hollow echo. I took a breath, my heart pounding in my ears. "No," I muttered to myself, barely above a whisper. "I can get out. I can." I turned, running for the front door, but as I reached for the handle, the world shifted again. The walls stretched, the ceiling lowered. The hallway seemed to elongate endlessly, far beyond the confines of the house. The door, just a few feet away, suddenly seemed miles out of reach. I felt trapped, suffocated by the sheer weight of the space around me. The figure was closer now. I could hear its steps as it moved, its slow, deliberate pace sending a chill down my spine. I ran again, but the walls seemed to close in on me. There was no escape. "It's over," the figure murmured as it reached out. I stumbled, falling to the ground. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. Desperation surged through me, and I scrambled, trying to push myself up, but I couldn't find my footing. The ground itself was shifting, changing beneath me. It was as if the house was no longer a house at all, just a place caught between dimensions, suspended in a nightmare. "It's not over," I heard my own voice saying, but I didn't believe it. The figure's hand brushed my shoulder, its fingers cold, like ice. The moment it touched me, everything went black. When I awoke, I was outside again. The world around me had changed. The streets were empty, the houses still and silent. The faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, but it wasn't the same, it was somehow worse. The oppressive quiet pressed against my chest, and I realized then that there was no escaping this place. I had become part of it. And I knew, deep down, that whatever had brought me here wasn't done with me yet. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.